Yes, sitting, you agree we've had a very rich panel. There's already a question. Yes, yes, Dr. Murli, yes.
I am Dr. Murli from Cambridge. I'm a physician by training and also a PhD from Cambridge. So I've done work on biophysics. I'm now doing work on population genetics. Recently there was a paper from Calcutta which shows...
Give them the mic. Oh. Recording. Is there a mic? Go ahead, we can hear you.
Recently there was a paper from Calcutta which actually wrongly analyzed because it used a wrong parameter to show that caste formed during caste by birth, which is the definition for caste as given by Ambedkar, if you have read his work, formed during Gupta period. But then their own data showed that it was across the entire India, from the north to the south, and then 200 years later in east of India, that's Bengal and Orissa. And Guptas were not there at that time, actually, in east of India and also in the south of India. They were in the Gangetic plain. So obviously the data was contradicted. So I followed it up with a paper which was again published in PNAS as a letter following up on this article, which clearly showed that actually it formed, of course the data shows it forms abruptly. My further analysis showed that it formed during the Muslim era, and it exactly overlaps with the progression of the Muslim invasion wave. So given these kind of population genetics data that we have, it's very hard to actually falsify DNA genetic data or to disprove it or to refute it. Given this kind of strong evidence we have on population genetics side these days, it came in March 2016, and then looking at archaeology, recently near Sivaganga, they found a site which is exactly like Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, which is like south, like near Madurai. So having this kind of strong scientific data from archaeology and population genetics and fields like that, shouldn't we also be on the offensive?
Yes.
Using also the historic data, like that, the German genocide in North Africa, the Red Indian genocide in the entire American continent, Australia, Aboriginal genocide. Using these historical data and then this really strong scientific data, shouldn't we be going on an offensive? I am seeing now is we still on the defensive, talking about the Sanskrit interpretation. I'm least bothered about.
What is the question?
The question is, shouldn't we be going on an offensive? Anybody, and including the panel, we should be on the offensive. Okay. Why are we on the defensive?
Let me throw another challenge to you, all of you. I think Hindus, or at least maybe not you yourself, but your great-grandfathers, are to blame. So if you want to complain, go complain to them. Because it is it is the orthodox castes of a few generations ago who said that caste is based on the Purusha Sutta. Caste is already present in the Rig Veda, which Pollock also says. And he adds that even the racial interpretation of caste was already there. Anyway, now the thing is that caste has known a big evolution, and caste as conceived in the Middle Ages was not present in the Rig Veda. It only describes four functions in society. It says not how people were recruited for these functions, who can marry whom and so on, nothing about that. But you see, there's an important incident in the life of the Buddha that says a lot about this. You see, there is a friend of the Buddha, King Prasenajit of Kosala. He discovers that his wife is not a real princess, that she's in fact an illegitimate child. You see the king with some maid, who's a Tibetan. And so, so anyway, the king repudiates his wife and the son that they have together because they are not endogamous same caste. And it's the Buddha who says, no, caste is only patrilineal. You see, if you are a Kshatriya, then your son is a Kshatriya no matter what the mother is. Now apparently this was the old conception of caste. When caste started to become hereditary, it's first only on the paternal side. And then later, gradually, probably first in the royal families, it becomes endogamous. You have to marry the same caste. And that has, evolved socially to the lower caste and also geographically. From the western Ganga plain, it went to Bengal, to the south, and so on. And so it may have, caught on a bit later than the Buddha. That I leave to your technical knowledge. But so, you see, Hindus themselves have projected the caste system that they knew in the 18th century back to the Vedas, and that's definitely not correct.
Exactly, that's exactly what we say, that your point about being offensive is well taken, or rather taking the offensive without being offensive. But I think there's a separate Indology conference in the offing on caste. So we will keep the caste issue for that. And for this panel, let's concentrate on this particular paper, Deep Orientalism of Pollock. And if you have inputs on how to be on the offensive or sort of really attack Pollock on this, it would be useful to get your inputs, because caste is just a small fraction of this whole paper. Yes?
I think also along those lines, we should clarify the purpose of this conference is to help the scholars finish their papers and publish a book. Really, because that's what we're doing. We're reviewing papers, all of them are going to be in a book, so help them with whatever you can. That's the whole idea. Right? So, Gopinath, one point, Pollock explains very clearly in another writing what has happened that led him to this deep Orientalism. Edward Said's Orientalism creates a conflict, a crisis in South Asian studies and Indology, because it accuses all of them essentially of being racist. Because Orientalism itself has become very tainted enterprise, and that whole profession is now tainted as something horrible. So there is a crisis, and Pollock in fact writes somewhere that these people have become imported, not knowing what they're supposed to do, and they're looking for a new direction. He gives a direction by saying, so they have all stopped studying. There's a crisis because people think that if you study, you'll be accused of being one of those Orientalists. So he comes up with this thing saying, it is not the Orientalists whose fault it was Sanskrit that already had these problems, which he calls deep Orientalism. So Sanskrit had these problems already, so it is not the Orientalist problems. In doing so, he is falsifying Edward Said in a sense, and giving a new agenda for Orientalism, which is the Orientalism 2.0, which says now we will accuse Sanskrit of being all these things. So therefore this business that it is frozen, it has no freedom, it is causing the Holocaust, all the social abuses, becomes the new, rather than avoiding Sanskrit studies, which the left were doing, avoiding Sanskrit, study it to find that it is the culprit. That's the originality of it.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead.
Thanks. I just want to add also one more thing. That you mentioned the book on paper and Shastra, then the paper on Ramayana. Now the paper on Shastra essentially saying that things are codified, inflexible, and then the paper on Ramayana says that you tend to obey those kind of codified rules. Now you essentially become automatons. Once you become automatons, now you can do anything for that matter. You can also involve in genocide. And that is the third paper, which is this thing paper of what is deep learning. So in a sense, there is some kind of progression I can see between the way he is building up the arguments and then he's tying up with the political situation that is developing in India at the same time. So there is a certain interweaving of possibilities and ideas, and he is doing it reasonably skillfully.
And he's leading to liberation, that he says that now I'm liberated from all that. We have to destroy all that.
I just wanted to add on what Rajiv sir was saying, that Orientalism is a problem for Pollock, not because of racism, but because Orientalism Orientalism says that it is Indology that made Sanskrit Dharmashastras hegemonic and gave them a legal force. And this is what is problematic for Pollock, and what he wants to say is that Sanskrit Dharmashastras always had a legal force, they were always hegemonic. Indology was recapitulating all that, and instead of that, it should have questioned the hegemony, it should have challenged that hegemony, and this is what Orientalism 2.0 should do.
That is correct. So this is the inauguration of 2.0.
Other questions, have some comments on this?
Just one
Yes,
question.
go ahead.
Out of India theory, can you just elaborate on that?
Out of India.
India. Out of India theory.
Yeah.
Can you just elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, the fact that, or the idea that the Indo-European languages and their speakers originated in India. Well, their speakers, of course, that mixed a lot. The theory of the Indo-European languages, at any rate, implies that languages can cross racial frontiers. Because either they started in India and went to Europe, or they started in Europe and went to India. But at any rate, they linguistically converted the native population, either way. Now, in the case of this internal Orientalism of which Sanskrit is accused, you see, Pollock may or may not say that this is racial, but at the back of his mind, it certainly is racial. Because, the term Orientalism means that you have natives and foreigners. The British go to India and they start studying India, and that is Orientalism, but the British in India stood out as foreigners. Even others who visited India and studied it, were foreigners. And so if you call the Sanskrit domination a form of Orientalism, you are already implying that the Brahmins in India were foreigners, which is indeed exactly what the Aryan invasion theory says.
Yes, I think the papers have left all of you speechless. They've all been so well organized and ordered that, well, maybe I'll spark off something. How much time do we have?
7 minutes.
7 minutes. Then maybe I should give my own comments, a few, and then see if there are more questions at the end. So let me start with Asha's paper. And I think that it had a very extensive review of research. But perhaps in terms of the overall objective, if you focus more on Pollock and sharpened your critique of him, because I think that your presentation gave the fact that gave the impression at least that Indology itself is confused, like Pollock claims Orientalism is confused. And in a sense, Pollock is trying to rehabilitate Orientalism. But he also does it by changing its vector. That is, instead of looking at the West, looking at the East. He talks about the East's impact on the West, Sanskrit impacting Nazism, So he's changing the direction and then discrediting German Indology. So that all that remains, as Ruendal points out, is this new transatlantic Orientalism led by Pollock, which is to say that all other competitors are killed off, just as Microsoft or Google would. So this is a brilliant ploy to say that now the authoritative knowledge of the Orient will be produced from North America, no longer from Europe, because Said in a way discredited the European project of Orientalism. And of course, the more insidious project is to turn it into liberation philology and then champion. But really, the question now, which really applies to all of us here, is how we should turn the idea of the comparative morphology of domination so as to include United States, its academy, how it co-opts resistance, how it neutralizes opponents, and finally, how it can raise funding from the very people it oppresses. I mean, this is just like getting cloth made from Indian cotton, sent to Manchester, produced into mill cloth, and then brought back and sold to Indians. It's a rejig, it's a reinvention of an older colonial. So I'm saying that to come back to go to Gopi's paper, I think he does a kind of reverse morphology of domination, looking at all the Western typologies and forms and methodologies. And if you even think about the word concentration camp, the word concentration here means the intensification of military, and in that particular Boer War, the second Boer War context, when the British invented this, the concentration of non-combatants in one area. And so this is used obviously later by the Nazis, it was also used by the Soviets. See? And when we speak about the isolation and the exclusion in localities, the Europeans practiced it. They always had ghettos and these ghettos were much older, possibly, because when you read from Malhotra and Ramayana, you don't see special quarters for special castes or communities. So again, the the idea of segregation of some kind of apartheid, and what about the US, which created these reservations? They actually called them reservations for Native Americans, where Native Americans were, confined. So the point being that I think what Gopiji does so effectively, which can be sharpened with more examples, with more evidence, the holocausts of the Europeans on their own, on others, the destruction of gypsies, Romas, etc. So this can be done, and we can actually ask, why is Pollock interjecting, or you might even say interpolating Sanskrit into this narrative while absolving the United States itself as an imperialist, neo-colonialist power? I mean, how come there's that line? So why is not the complicity of the United States Academy ever examined in the structure of the morphology, the comparative morphology of domination, exempts Pollock in his own power? And this, you see, how area studies begins. It's very well documented what the CIA had to do. So he excludes himself from that lens and points it out. So I think Gopiji is... Yes, please.
That's what the reservations idea. I think first was practiced in Nepal. And then Namibia, now I'm talking about reservations as a place to keep all the Native Americans. So, and then this was copied by the Germans in Namibia. They also had reservations, and these were basically systematically, let us say, stop of water, and they wanted to ensure that they would fought for their particular directions. They could not, they were actually hunted and resistance of this country.
Exactly. So I think that what we have to point out is this much more blatant and brutal record has been erased or elided in Pollock's account, and he directs his sort of gaze outward towards these sources without any evidence, without pointing out how that actually resulted in the Nazi idea.
Actually, Pollock does mention that. So in the issues that he raises for the future of Indology, he does speak of American imperialism, the fact that it co-opts the American scholarship. In fact, Said's Orientalism itself occurred under American imperialism and so on, which is why he then proposes that we need a morally sensitive scholarship, that all scholarship is biased, and therefore the only standard we can have is that if the scholarship favors the marginalized, oppressed, and so on, then it's good scholarship, otherwise it's bad.
Yes. Now, see, this is a very good point. I actually wanted to come to it after bringing in Conrad's presentation. I mean, since you raised it, if you see the beginning of Pollock's essay, he uses classic, within quotes, classic leftist, Marxist terminology by talking about, progress and progressive and reactionary. These are some of the phrases he uses. I've underlined it in my copy. Now, however, again, you see how these terms migrate from classical Marxist economics kind of discourse, revolutionary discourse, to ideological discourse. See, because in Marx, the idea of what was reactionary was very clear. I mean, whatever stopped revolution was reactionary. So the proletariat and its interests were the benchmark, were the real sort of, you might call it the gold standard of measurement. Now, since that is lacking, so he's got a very wishy-washy notion of who is oppressed that's never defined. There's not even a pseudo-scientific way in terms of class. Working class versus bourgeoisie. There's not even a pseudoscience. So, the way to counter this is by saying, what is the evidence that you don't become a broker of backwardness? That this subalternism isn't a mask of conquest. That is, you always say that we are championing the cause of the have-nots, but that's only a way to legitimate your own privileges and to mask how powerful American academia is. So that can be countered by saying lacking any, so to speak, objective and verifiable standards of who is actually oppressed in society, that's just a whitewash to be anti-Hindu, to be anti-Brahmanical, to be anti-whatever. But I think you ended by asking a very valid question. Let us say for the time being that we don't like the kind of Indology or Orientalism 2.0, or call it what you will, that Pollock practices. What are we going to do? Are we simply going to do re-Brahminizing? Are we doing a neo-Brahminism here? Are we also going to defend everything? Are we neo-traditionalists? By we, I mean, do we have nothing else to do except oppose Pollock, or are we really, do we have our own agenda? That is why yesterday when we spoke briefly, I said, at least I come to this from the Swarajist point of view, which is there is a Swaraj Parampara, and the Swaraj Parampara is interested in resisting domination, but it is also deeply interested in self-restraint, that when we become powerful, Swaraj doesn't mean ruling others. So I think that we have to make clear that this is not merely a way to re-dominate, re-Brahminize, or whatever these terms might be, that by interrogating Pollock, what is going on is actually a way to, you might say, regain the self-respect of a civilization, or whatever it is, however we frame our own positive Indology. We can't simply be negativists and say that the whole purpose is to refute Pollock, because Pollock is this great demon, this Rakshasa, and we are the Vaivik people, etc. I mean, so I think your point about what Indology should be doing is very, very important, because many Sanskritists, are scattered. They don't have any bigger agenda, the master narrative that Rajiv talks about. They're just doing their own work. Many people are merely careerists. There's also academics just for survival. So, I've written about this extensively by using the Guna theory. There's tamasic academics, there's rajasic, there's sattvic, blah blah. Some are doing it for moksha. But there's no overall understanding of what we should do and how we should collaborate. How post-colonialists should collaborate with Sanskritists. I mean, it's no accident that an English professor started a center for Sanskrit studies. I mean, in JNU, the others couldn't do it. So, I mean, let's face it, that there are these big issues. So, wither Indology is important, otherwise it will be really wither. It will wither away, right? Weather. After withering, there will be only weathering. And coming to Conrad's, I've made some, like he always does, it's a very systematic exposition, and he very clearly shows that what Pollock is doing is really supplying no evidence for making the claim that somehow Sanskrit and Indology were responsible for Nazism. So I think that these gaps, and so this is actually, you might call it, political philology at its worst. I think this is what we have to really talk about. We have to say that in the name of liberation philology, here is an example of political philology at its worst, because it produces distortions, it demonizes traditions, and actually creates, I would call it magnificent misinformation. But I think this has to be very well coordinated, and again, I think supplied to supporters, funding agencies, whoever this Anand Raghunathan is, in whose name he holds a chair. We should be sending these things to his descendants or his family members, if he's still alive, to say, is your name to be used for this kind of work, to distort and demonize a tradition which you should be evidently proud of? Exactly. That's what I'm trying to say. So, at both ends of the spectrum, in the United States and in India, because in fact, at the risk of being considered a bit, narcissistic, I wanted to quote from my own, I wanted to quote from my own, paper. Not paper, it was really an op-ed which came out in Business Standard called The Deepest Orientalist. And I wrote to New York Times, it wasn't published. I sent it to so many places, nobody wants to publish it. And then the editor of Business Standard, he made me cut it down from 1400 words to 800 words. and then he published a 2,500-word letter against it. I mean, this is a crazy thing. I mean, what's going on in India? Anyhow, so in that I said that the deepest Orientalist is somebody, if I can find it, I can tell you, because it ends with this pithy kind of way of framing how I'll just read it. How deep an Orientalist he is can be seen by he has reinvented Orientalism so that he gets wealthy Indians to sponsor his endowed professorship, also getting them to pay him for letting them know how bad their texts and traditions are. Knowing how self-hating we Indians are, Mr. Pollock and his band of neo-Orientalists will not go out of business for a long time. This is what I said. Anyhow, so we are done. The session is closed and you are invited to tea. Thank you.